Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros and LEAP, helping students to succeed in all kinds of tests from 8th grade to grad school throughout Ohio.
And I'm Mike Bergen, president of Chariot Learning, helping students with test school and life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 60 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and admissions. So let's get down to tests and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is preparing for a college admissions interview. But first, let's meet our special guest, Alison Slater.
Alison Slater graduated from Bucknell University and worked in selective college admission for 15 years. Interviews were her favorite part of the college application process, but she found they were often missed opportunities when students arrived nervous or unprepared. They were checking a box, not maximizing an opportunity. Alison founded Interview Prep to help students make strong impressions by preparing thoughtfully and approaching each interview with confidence and a plan. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Alison, we are really happy to have you on the show to talk about a topic that we wish we had more opportunity to discuss. Interviews are fantastic. Before we dive into that, we'd love to hear a bit about your background and why it is that your practice in admissions has brought you to focus on interviews.
Yeah, just like Amy said, I always loved the interviews. It was a one-on-one opportunity to get to know a student a little bit. And I think they just sometimes didn't look at it as an opportunity. Instead, it looked at it as something that they had to do or were supposed to do. And so they would leave with that feeling of, phew, I did it, instead of really connecting. And it's such a good opportunity. One of the biggest things a student can take away from an interview is that they've gained an advocate. No matter who they're interviewing with, whether that's a student, an alum, or an admission professional, that person has a voice on some level and is able to distinguish them from the other applicants.
It's interesting because at this juncture of these kids' lives, right, the idea of meeting with an adult and talking about themselves would be nerve-wracking, right? Because think about it, most of them or many of them, they might not have ever had even a job interview at this point. And yet here they are, like a big interview and being asked kind of adult questions by somebody where there's some import, right, to those conversations.
Sure, I think nerves are a part of this, and just the fact that you're meeting somebody new, and most people are raised to be humble, and then we turn around and say, let's talk about you. That's really tough. And so I think for a lot of students, the first interview sometimes feels like a first draft. And so I try to tell them, if you wouldn't turn in the first draft of an essay, I think you should also approach your interviews just as thoughtfully and do a little practice.
It's funny that you say that. So I do some volunteer work for my alma mater, John Carroll, with the business students, where they have to do elevator pitches and talk about themselves. And I still remember one of the kids one time said, like, should I mention that I'm an all-American athlete? Like, because he goes, it feels like that might be bragging. And I'm like, honey, this is
Yeah.
your opportunity to, like, tell them everything great about yourself. It's the one time in life where,
Yeah.
like, you get bragging rights. And I think a lot of kids, they don't understand that that's an important element of the interviewing process.
Yes, and honestly, any kid who says, I'm worried I'm going to be bragging is probably not going to cross that line. That's kind of my rule of thumb. If they're nervous about that at all, they probably won't go too far.
Yeah, but by the same token, they might not go far enough, like Amy says.
Exactly.
I think that the entire college admissions process is an opportunity for students to reconnect with who they are, evaluate what it is that they've done, package that, but also kind of dwell on, like, these are the things I've done, and these are how I have to sort what I discuss in my extracurricular list, or my activities list, what I talk about in my essay, what I talk about in each supplemental. And so by the time a student gets to the interview process, that should be the culmination of this journey of self-discovery that I guess when you conceive of an admissions process, you're hoping that that happens, that students come
Hmm.
through this process more in touch with who they are and what they want. And yet, when students have an opportunity to actually articulate that in person, they don't see it that way at all.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I frame this as you prep, and I encourage students to start as early as spring of junior year before they go into their summer break. But the reflection they're doing, that self-reflection and the practice talking about their accomplishments and the process of getting to know what is most important to share is actually really beneficial in writing their essays and preparing their applications as a whole.
But it's also like Like in the same way, the essay prep, people think essay prep is just grammar, like write, you have to be a good writer. No, it's about figuring out what you want to say. It's all an extension of that.
So if I'm understanding sort of where we're going with this, it kind of sounds like we're talking about almost like curating yourself, right? So I would imagine then in that process of curation, you're preparing. So let's talk a little bit about why then is it so important that students do this kind of preparation before they land in that interview seat?
Yeah, for one thing, I think you don't want them to have that sort of first draft feeling where they leave going, oh man, I just survived. Or have those regrets. We've all left a conversation where we've turned around later and said, oh, if only I had said it this way. By having some actual practice, because I use mock interviews and I encourage students to do mock interviews with anybody who they can to practice. That will help them to feel like they know how they want to articulate certain things about themselves. And it's funny you mentioned an elevator pitch earlier. That's exactly the language I use with students as well. I encourage them to build what I call a personal elevator pitch. It starts with a little bit of that, what's your name, what's your age, what's your high school, but then they identify usually 4 or 5 really important bullet points about themselves that they know they want to share. And they take that with them into each interview. They can use it as it is. It's rare that they have an opportunity to use the whole pitch. They're not on Shark Tank, but it's an outline in their head so that when somebody says, hey, is there anything we haven't talked about yet that's important? They can say, yes, actually, because they know they have that one bullet point they didn't get to yet. Oh, we didn't talk about that research I did my senior year or something along those lines. And it's a great checklist at the end of the interview to just quickly go through 1, 2, 3, got it covered. I had a great interview.
How much of interview prep, when students should prepare for an interview, how much of it focuses not on what they say, but how they say it and how they hold themselves?
I tend to give a handful of tips and feedback about their physical presence, but for most students, once they start to get more comfortable in the setting itself and talking about themselves, that's not a huge issue for most people. I do think, we talk about eye contact on occasion. It's even trickier if they're doing a virtual interview. I remind them to shake hands and introduce themselves when they arrive if they're doing an in-person interview, and especially if they're going to campus and bringing a family member with them. It's such a small change, but for the student to step up first and say, hi, my name is Allison, and this is my mom, and introduce her or whoever you've brought with you, it's actually a really mature step that a student can take.
Well, what you're describing is being assertive, right? Like there's something about seeing, and I'm sure Mike, you see this just with our students. There's something about a student who kind of carries themselves with this sort of maturity and confidence that I always am very caught off guard by because so many kids, teenagers, right, are very unassertive. They're not confident. They sort of wear that on their sleeve. And so what I think it's so striking sometimes when a student does those behaviors, we're like, oh, wow, I'm impressed immediately just by their demeanor in how they're handling themselves.
I agree with you completely. Isn't it a compliment that young adults or teenagers receive when their parents are told, oh, they speak so well with adults?
Yes.
There's a difference, right? Like students can be assertive in their peer group, but then they shrink when it comes time to speak to adults, especially adults in a position to either help them advance their goals or frustrate them. And again, as you say, Amy, when we think about our students, I think of some students who I work with who I think, oh, I hope they get an interview because they'll crush it.
Yes. Yes.
And then I think of other students for whom, if they don't prepare for an interview, literally told parents, like, you have got to help your
I've had those same
wonderful,
thoughts.
but shy, introverted, uh, lacking confidence teen to do a little prep just to generate some energy, to make eye contact. It's even more important when virtual interviews because you don't have an opportunity to be physically present. You can't do that handshake at the beginning. So you can't look down at just like look down and not make eye contact, look away, seem distracted, things like that. Bad idea.
hmm Yeah, I think teenagers can be awkward with adults who they don't know yet. And so, in the case of how they interact with their parents, I often encourage them in advance to have that conversation. The same way you might have a conversation on the way to the college about which topics you each get to cover when asking questions. Hey, I want to be in charge of asking all the academic questions. Mom and dad, you can be in charge of asking the questions about financial aid or whatever they're really most passionate about. It's the same for the interview. I would encourage them to have that conversation in advance and say, hey, I'm going to introduce you. I'm going to go up to the front desk and check in. Just those little things make a difference.
So we do know that like not every college does offer the opportunity of an interview. Sometimes they're optional. So are they really important if many colleges don't offer them?
I think for a student who doesn't interview, it's not usually a big deal. And especially if it's invitation only, sometimes that really has to do with the college's capacity to interview so many students. So that's not a bad thing. But for the student who does have the opportunity, I always encourage them to take it with a little bit of preparation. I think more colleges do interviews than most people think. I use data from NACAC, and I'm curious, would you like to guess what percent of colleges you two think will do interviews typically?
Okay, I'm going to say 20%.
Okay.
Yeah, I like 20. I'd go even lower than say like 15%.
That's super interesting. I love this statistic. And this is, in some capacity. So some colleges will interview only for certain majors or only by invitation. But NACAC's data says 45% use interviews in some capacity in their
Oh, wow.
admission decisions.
I'm
Mhm.
shocked by that. That is way higher than I would have
Yeah,
expected.
I'm sure you've seen
Yeah,
that chart where they say, what are the factors in admission
sure.
decisions? So 4% say that interviews have considerable importance, which I think feels right. You don't want this to be the biggest factor, at least not at most
Mm-hmm.
places. Academics come first, but another
Mm-hmm.
41% use them in some capacity. So the other thing is, interviews will come up in a student's life even when they're not expecting it. It may not be for admission, it may be for a scholarship, it may be when they get on campus for a leadership position or a student job, an internship, and eventually for graduate school and professional jobs.
What's funny when you talk about the 4%, that almost makes me think, yeah, it's only 4%, but there could be 4% of students where something they do in the interview is something that like would not have been information accessible about the student, like anywhere on their application that somehow lands in that interviewer's mind, where that might be
Yeah.
something that could be very helpful for student in the final
Yeah.
round.
Aren't there levels of like finer and finer sieves or filters where you
Sure.
have a lot of students that look the same on paper in terms of grades and test scores and activities, and then you dig like there's another filter with the essay,
Hmm.
which most of them are the same, but the admissions people are looking for the one that would say, well, you're not right for us, or we're going to advance you to the next level. And then like the interview is like another level. Everyone who shows up, I imagine that everyone who gets invited to an interview would be a great candidate. But they're looking for another reason to say yes or no. I think, I mean, Allison, you've done a lot of college interviews. I have not, but I imagine that they're looking for more reasons to say no than yes.
I don't I think in the long run in admission in selective places, of course, they have to say no to more students than they say
That's what I'm
yes
saying. Not that
to.
they want to say, like
Right,
they're
right,
dying
yeah.
to say, you're out of here. But they have too many good choices.
Yes, that's exactly how I talk about it. I tell people, for the most part, admission officers are looking for reasons to say yes. But in the end, depending on which school they work for, they sometimes have to say no more often than they can say yes. But they are looking for the positives. And the scenario I use often is when you get down to the middle, that's the toughest part. So there's the students who are not even qualified for each college, who are easier to say no to. And then there's the students who are rock stars. For whatever reason, they may be academic standouts, they may have other factors that make them stand out. Those are the easier ones to say yes to. When you get to the middle, where some of those profiles and numbers start to look the same, the actual question around the table is, well, who stands out? And it's not necessarily who stands out in a bad way. That will occasionally come up, but mostly it's like these candidates are all qualified. We're choosing among qualified candidates, so who stands out? And I think that's when an interviewer can raise their hand and say, I met this student, and here's what I know about her.
Exactly. Okay, I have a good question here.
Yeah.
If a student is offered an interview, should the student take it?
I would say yes. So some
Is
schools
there,
you
okay, let
can,
me rephrase it.
okay.
If a student is offered an interview, is there a potential negative repercussion for not taking it?
Sometimes at some colleges you can just sign up. Interviews are available and that's up to you. At more selective places where the volume is really high, they may be doing this by invitation only. And in that case, they're probably indicating something to you. Either we have alums in your area and we'd love to meet you, or we aren't sure what to do with this application and we'd like more information. So for most students, yes, they should take the interview. For students who are going to be uncomfortable, who don't feel confident, there's a chance they might want to say no. It's rare that an interview hurts you. The one example I can think of is the student who came into my office when I was working at admission and said, I don't want to be here. And that we immediately pivoted and had a very different conversation. His mom was an alum. She was really excited about the school. He wasn't, but he was very articulate about what he did want. And we had a good conversation about other things. And ultimately, I kept his confidence when I met his mom, but you can bet we did not admit that student. There was no reason for us to do that.
You mentioned something that's kind of interesting, which is that you were differentiating who the interviewer can be. So, for example, some people I think we're talking about admissions representative, but we do know that a lot of universities activate their alumni network for interviewing purposes. I guess I'm wondering, should students look at who the interviewer is in any way to think about the interview differently? I'm wondering.
Typically, no. The colleges will say an interview is an interview. Most of them won't offer you the opportunity to do more than one. So whatever they're offering, that's what you would take. Sometimes it's professional admission staff on campus or as they travel, as they get out on the road. Sometimes it's a student who's been trained to do interviews on campus. Those are my favorites actually because you can talk to them about student life and they're trained to do the admission interview and answer the admission questions. The alums are honestly a mixed bag. Some of them are really well trained. Some of them have been out for many, many years and they're very nostalgic, but they're not super well trained on the current statistics. I think they're all
Mhm.
well meaning though, and it is rare that an interview will truly be a negative factor for a student. So I think the conversation is always worthwhile.
Yeah, I have a friend who's been doing for years interviews locally for a selective college, and he takes it really seriously, and he's excited, and he does get invested, like in wanting to be an advocate. Like, oh yeah, like this would be a great student for the school. There are a lot of alums that have that connection to the spirit of the school, or at least the way they interpret it.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. So let's talk then about preparation. Like who should prep? How should they do it? What do you need to do to make this effective?
Sure. I think to some degree, everybody can benefit from interview prep. And in terms of teenagers, I mentioned earlier, there's lots of times they might interview in the near future, even if that's not for college admission. So I encourage them to start at the end of their junior year if they have the chance. The interviews will typically happen either over the summer or in the fall of senior year. Most interview deadlines are similar to the regular decision deadlines at the college. Um, Occasionally, a student will want to prepare for a particular interview, and in that case, I'm asking them really specific questions about that school or about that opportunity. And that means I do a little bit of homework before that session as well. But but this is something that will come up for everyone. So mock interviews are probably the best way to prepare, whether you're working with a professional or you're asking your mom, your guidance counselor, your best friend. Anybody can do this. There's lists of questions all over the internet that will give you a bit of the flavor of what a college interview will be like. And you can look up a particular school as well. There are a couple of them who are known for having a certain style of interviewing, a college who maybe is really involved in politics and really active in that way. They might ask you about the political stories that you're following and things along those lines. What about what you've been seeing in the news? So there's a lot students can do, but ultimately it comes down to a little bit of self-reflection and building some confidence through practice.
So so you're talking about kind of this idea of finding questions online, talking to people. It sounds like a lot of the time it's just doing more talking about yourself and being thoughtful or predictive, you know, what in terms of like going into the fall and these interviews, how can students prepare for all the interviews they're likely to have coming up? Like kind of what can they do?
Well, one thing I tell them is you are a subject expert when the subject is yourself. So students who go in with no preparation, they usually do fine. They're talking about themselves, it's going to be okay, but then it's kind of a neutral factor in their application. So in order to maximize the opportunity, that's where the preparation can really come into play. And they can't prepare for every single question, just like in life. But one of the things that I encourage them to do is if they hear something new or unexpected, to take a breath, take a beat before they answer. Most interviewers will recognize that they'll get a well thought out answer if the student takes that minute to think, but they can even say, hey, I haven't heard that before. I need a moment to think about it, and give themselves that space.
I always love the response of, well, that's a really good
Yes, that's a
Mhm.
question.
filler for time.
Right. But it makes it sound like the person's like really thinking and wanting to be intentional in their
Yeah.
response, but it also is giving them an opportunity for, you know, a
Yeah.
pause, right? I'm wondering, like, so this makes me think about specific questions. Are there any questions that you can think of that your students might have had that either were like gotcha questions, you know, or can you share like what are some very standard, like some very, I've got to believe a very standard question would be the like, why do you like our university?
Oh
Why do
yeah,
you want
could
to
you
come to our
imagine not having an
university?
answer for that?
Of course I
Yeah,
can. I've been in that scenario.
Ah, what a rookie
Um,
move.
but I can't
she's seen
imagine
it,
not
Mike.
preparing a student for that
Yes, right.
question, Mike. Yes,
That feels like an obvious
that
like one
classic
to be
classic
prepared for.
question, which is worth preparing for each school because a lot of them ask this in writing in their applications as
Of
well,
course.
but some version of
Exactly.
why us. And I teach students to answer that as if they asked why you for us, because I really do think it's a two-sided street. If you if you're actually just complimenting the college and giving them back the things they've said in their brochures, I promise you, because I've been there, they will chuckle and say, we know, we wrote the brochures.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Why you
instead,
for us is a nice way to put it, and what are you
right.
bringing? What are you going to bring to our
Right. What
campus?
is it specifically about that college that you will take advantage of? And what are you bringing to the table as well? Because you want the college to be just as proud of you as you are of them. This really should be a mutual fit. I know fit is kind of a buzzword in admission, but I really believe
Hmm.
in that. I have lots of favorite questions, but I always start my interviews when I was working in admission and now in doing mock interviews with something along the lines of, can you tell me about your high school as if I've never heard of it before? And yes, I've asked this question while sitting in the college office at a high school, but the idea is to give the student a layup. Most of them have been there for at least 3 years at that point, and to give them something very open-ended and see where they take it. It gives me a gauge of how chatty they'll be. And then it's my job to ask follow-up questions. If they tell me all about some of the social stuff, I can redirect and say, okay, tell me about the academic fit at your school. I can always tell who's a tour guide because they give me fact, 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 and a personal story. So you can tell they've answered
Hmm.
that question before. I also ask big things like, why do you want to go to college? And you both work in the field, it might not surprise you as much, but a lot of people are surprised at how tough that question can be to answer
Mhm.
without saying, isn't that what I'm supposed to do next? So to
Right.
take the time to think about a few of these things in advance, it just helps the student seem more articulate and more confident in their next step. I also ask them, what's your proudest accomplishment so far? And they think for a minute and they all have an answer for that question. But a week later or a month later, even if they haven't been actively practicing, that song's been sort of noodling around, or that question's been noodling around in their head. And they have the opportunity to either speak more articulately or to maybe change their mind and speak about something else.
Hmm.
That's fantastic. Is there any aspect of the college interview and students' readiness for it that we haven't discussed that you wanted to make sure we covered?
Nothing big. I mean, I have lots of tips. There's tips on my website. There's a list of questions on my website that students
Yeah,
can
we'll include
review.
that link in the show notes.
Thank you. I mean, I often tell them if they get a question that feels too broad, they can intentionally narrow their response and say, well, here's three things I'd like you to go, like you to know. One, two, three. And then that gives them an obvious stopping point instead of just going on forever or feeling like they're stopping awkwardly. Same thing if a question feels too narrow. Sometimes an interviewer will ask a lot of questions that can be answered with yes or no. And you can use the old improv trick and say yes and give them an example so that you can share a little bit more information.
Isn't that bad interviewing, asking yes, no questions?
I think it is. I'm trying to
Could we
be
have a whole
diplomatic.
other episode
Um,
on how to actually conduct the effective college admissions interview?
Absolutely. I am actually gearing up to launch something where I help train other IECs to do interview prep with
There,
their own
there you
students
go.
if they'd like to do that. I don't think it's a great approach to an interview to ask a lot of yes, no questions, but sometimes it's just not a professional interviewer. Sometimes they fall into a habit or they're a little bit nervous as well. But I also, I hate to use the word hate, but I hate the question, tell me about yourself. It's not even always phrased as a question,
Yeah.
and it
Oh,
feels too
it's
broad.
so
So
broad.
that is a great opportunity to either give somebody your personal elevator pitch and say, here's who I am, here's a couple important things about me, or to at least limit that response and say, well, here's a few things I want you to know for sure. And then it is the interviewer's job to ask the follow-up question, I think.
That's fantastic. There's no doubt we could talk about college interviews with you all day, Allison. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
If listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can go to my website, interviewprepllc.com, and my email and my phone number are there.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next test and the rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Test and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.